Hello, and thank you for having me today. I am Lori Carr from the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society, and I am presenting for the Kootenay Lake Partnership and the Kootenay Association of Realtors today. I will be delving into invasive species and their impacts on real estate transactions. So the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society, or CKISS for short, is a nonprofit started in 2005. Our mission is protecting our ecosystems and communities by preventing and reducing the harmful impacts of invasive species. Our work is very collaborative, and we do a lot of coordinating with various agencies and groups. We are interested in involving all community members, including real estate professionals, because this work is multi-jurisdictional. It does involve everyone, which makes this a very fascinating and fun issue, if I may say so myself. Invasive species, what are they exactly? They are organisms that cause ecological or economic harm in a new environment where they are not native, and this is important, that they are outside of their natural range. A lot of our plant species especially come from Eurasia. They come over with shipping, airplanes, tourism, often transplanted intentionally for gardening or for medicinal purposes, agricultural purposes. Some common traits: they are initially and primarily dispersed by humans. This is very important when we look at trying to prevent the dispersal of invasive species. So there are a lot of behavior change programs, clean, drain, dry, I will talk about a little bit more. Another trait that is really important is the exponential growth, and we should be familiar with this graph from coronavirus news. And this shows a growth that at first doesn't seem like there's a lot of species, but if you're looking at, say, doubling a population every so once in a while, at first, there's not a lot, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, not a lot, but then all of a sudden you get it into higher numbers and the numbers start doubling at quite a rapid rate. And then at that point, it becomes very hard to eradicate that species and to control it. So we see exponential growth because of a high fecundity for most species that are invasive. They have a lot of seed production, or they can reproduce very easily, or they have a lot of babies' eggs. This allows them to outcompete our native species. They also lack predator control in a new environment, and this is why it's important that they are outside of their natural range. The third really important trait of an invasive species, which distinguishes it from, say, a naturalized species that has also come from outside of its range, is that these species cause harm. So invasive species are one of the greatest threats to biodiversity globally. They also cost an enormous amount of money to control, manage, eradicate, and they do cause a lot of damage, say, to agricultural crops, infrastructure. And so we are very concerned about these species for these reasons. There are 97 known invasive species in the Central Kootenay region, including the lovely American bullfrog, which is coming up from the States. You probably recognize species such as common tansy or knapweed. They're quite widespread. And knotweed, which we will be talking about a little bit more. So because this presentation was about shoreline properties, some invasive aquatic species of Kootenay Lake that are here are Eurasian milfoil and the curly-leaf pondweed. You might be familiar with milfoil. Kootenay Lake has quite a huge infestation. Champion lakes, there are removal programs for these because they impact swimming and recreation so much. And the tourism industry, of course. Risk of incursion are flowering rush, which is unfortunately still sold, so be careful of this one. Don't plant it. Parrot feather, zebra, and quagga mussels, which you may have seen the inspection stations for watercraft. For these ones along the highway, we do not have them in BC, and we do not want them in BC. So these are species that might affect your property value if you have a shoreline property. Clean, drain, dry, as I said, is aimed at making sure that watercraft do not transport invasive species such as whirling disease or any of the aquatic plants that I just mentioned, or the zebra quagga mussels. And this map on the right is just to show you the distribution and what we are dealing with. They're quite heavily infested on the east coast, and they are moving west, and we are trying to stop them, obviously, from getting into our lakes and impacting our infrastructure, like our hydro dams and our swimming and fishing etc., or fish populations. Another species that you will more than likely come across if you're dealing with private properties is knotweed. It's very widespread. This particular species is of concern because it can impact infrastructure because of its extensive rhizome or root network. It's quite strong, so where you wouldn't want a tree root, you would not want a knotweed root because it can get into the cracks in infrastructure and break your infrastructure, your foundation, get into septic tanks, etc. However, the big difference between this species and a tree species is that you can cut down a tree and it will die, but you cannot cut down knotweed because it only increases its spread. It's a very voracious plant. It can reproduce from fragments of roots or stems. So you basically do not want to disturb this plant. The only way of getting rid of it successfully is with herbicide control, and that does require a contractor and does cost quite a bit to get rid of this. It does take 3 to 5 years. It does spread quite voraciously. We get a lot of calls from property owners who have just bought a house and are just stunned that they are now dealing with this particular plant. And we also get calls from people looking to sell property or people that are looking at buying property and want to know the implications of buying a property with knotweed on it. So these next slides I have taken from the Invasive Species Council of BC online tool. I do highly suggest everyone go check it out. It's a short 30-minute webinar and has a lot of great information. So selling infested property. So the sale and purchase of private property infested with invasive species can quickly become complex, placing the sale at risk, especially if somebody knows their stuff and there's an extensive patch of knotweed. It is quite phenomenal what it takes to get rid of knotweed. So there are legal complications that could occur, and so it is advised to use the property disclosure statement with an infested property. Also, if you are involved in land development, be very aware of the distribution and movement of soil. Plant seed can remain viable for decades, so you don't want to be moving infested soil, and especially knotweed, you can dispose of it. That does require a cost to dispose of infested soil, so just be aware of that. Also, prevent disturbance of an area. I mean, if you have disturbed it, obviously, then you should restore it, reseed the area to minimize the incursions of new invasive species. And there are some legislation pieces that you should be aware of. That is the BC Weed Control Act, which means that property owners are legally responsible for controlling and removing invasive plants on their properties. And there is a schedule that lists the species that property owners are legally required to deal with. I do have to say there isn't a huge amount of enforcement of this Weed Control Act in our area, but we are working to change that. So hopefully there will be. Also be aware of official community plans or land use bylaws that might reference invasive species, such as unsightly premises or landscaping bylaws. And also be aware if there's a covenant on the land, because they might require the control of invasive species. So in order to get more information, please visit our website. We have a ton of information on there. We have the list of the regional priority species in our area. Also, there is the Invasive Species Council of BC online tool that I was referencing. This is a great resource, as well as they have a toolkit which has a huge amount of information on it if you want to get more information. Also, the BC Ministry of the Environment does have best management practices, and if you are develop with care, might be of interest to you. So in summary, in order to help your clients, inform them about the provincial and local legislation that applies to them. And if you are involved in a real estate transaction, do discuss the property disclosure statement and connect any property owners with the invasive species organization in their area. And there are 14 across the province, sister organizations. CKISS is more than happy to receive calls from the public. So just a quick shout out to our funders, especially the Columbia Basin Trust And please do visit our website at ckiss.ca. And we are now going to turn to questions. Thank you very much for having me today.